Ethan Carter pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself as the cold morning wind bit at his skin. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. He had more important things to worry about. Clutching a plastic bag filled with empty bottles and cans, he scanned the streets for anything else he could collect. The recycling center paid 5 cents per bottle, and he needed at least 30 to buy a loaf of bread from the discount store. Ethan's mother, Rebecca Carter, had been a nurse for over 15 years, working long hours to take care of others. But when the pain in her joints became unbearable, she could no longer perform delicate medical tasks. Her supervisors had told her to take time off until she got better, but the truth was, she wasn't getting better. Without a paycheck, they couldn't afford their apartment anymore, and little by little their savings vanished. Eventually, they had no choice but to move into their old blue sedan. Ethan checked behind Tony's Bakery, a small shop that sometimes threw away unsold pastries at the end of the day. His heart sank when he saw a new chain locking the dumpster shut. The owner, a stocky man in a flour-covered apron, stepped outside. "Sorry, kid, health department's cracking down. Can't leave it open anymore." Ethan lowered his gaze, swallowing his disappointment. He turned to leave when Tony sighed, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "Here." He handed Ethan a small paper bag. "I accidentally made an extra sandwich. Just don't tell anyone, all right?" Ethan's fingers tightened around the warm bag. "Thank you, Mr. Tony." He wanted to eat it right then and there, but he knew his mother needed it more than he did. The walk back to their car felt longer in the biting wind. Their old blue sedan sat at the far end of an abandoned parking lot, hidden behind overgrown bushes. As Ethan approached, he wiped the foggy window and peered inside. Rebecca was bundled in blankets, her face pale, her body curled up against the cold. "Mom," he whispered, tapping on the glass. Slowly she stirred, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Hey, baby," she rasped. Ethan held up the sandwich and his bag of bottles. Rebecca tried to smile, but winced. "My little provider," she murmured, but Ethan saw the pain in her eyes. He also saw something else, how much weaker she had gotten, and deep down he knew they couldn't keep living like this much longer. Ethan shoved his hands deep into his jacket pockets as he made his way through the crowded downtown plaza. His breath came out in white puffs against the frigid morning air, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on one thing: the folding tables near the back, stacked with bottled water and boxed lunches. If he timed it right, he could grab something when everyone was distracted. He had done it before, slipping through crowds, blending in like he belonged. Grown-ups barely noticed kids at these kinds of events. They were too busy cheering or listening to speeches. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Be careful, Ethan. Stay invisible. Don't talk to strangers. Don't let anyone follow you home." But hunger made rules harder to follow. He had to try. A woman with a clipboard stepped into his path, smiling warmly. "Here for the rally, young man? Where are your parents?" Ethan's heart pounded, but he forced a casual shrug. "Up front. My dad sent me to get water." She nodded, already turning to answer another person's question. Ethan seized the moment and slipped past her, inching closer to the food table. Just a few more steps, almost there. Wham! Ethan crashed straight into something, or rather, someone. A tall man in a dark suit, polished shoes, and an expensive-looking coat. The impact knocked Ethan off balance, and his plastic bag of bottles hit the ground, spilling its contents everywhere. Empty containers rolled across the pavement. "I'm sorry," Ethan gasped, dropping to his knees to gather them. His hands shook. Getting noticed was the last thing he wanted. "It's fine," came a deep, steady voice. "Here, let me help." Ethan flinched. Adults didn't usually offer help. They either ignored him or looked at him with pity, the kind of look he hated. But this man didn't sound annoyed. There was something else in his voice. The man crouched beside him, picking up a bottle and examining it. 5 cents each at the recycling center, right? Ethan froze. The man turned the bottle over in his hands. "My grandmother used to collect these," he said almost to himself. "She always said it was honest work, even if some people looked down on it." Ethan's fingers tightened around his bag. Most people pretended not to see what he was doing, or worse, whispered about him behind his back, but this man understood. The man handed Ethan the last bottle, meeting his eyes. "My name's JD." Ethan hesitated. He had learned to be wary of strangers, but something about JD felt different. "You know," JD continued, nodding toward the food tables, "they've got extra lunches over there, more than they need. Shame for them to go to waste." Ethan swallowed hard. I don't need." JD smiled, but there was something serious in his expression. "Everyone needs to eat." For a moment, Ethan wanted to argue, but then he thought about his mother, curled up under their blankets, too weak to even sit up some mornings. "My mom," he blurted out, surprising himself. "She needs food more than me." JD's face changed, just slightly, but Ethan noticed. It wasn't pity. It was something else, something deeper. "Where is she?" JD asked gently. Ethan hesitated. The wrong answer could mean social services. It could mean being separated from his mom. It could mean everything getting worse. JD seemed to sense his fear. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I just want to help." Ethan bit his lip. His instincts told him to run. That's what his mother had always taught him. If adults asked too many questions, run. But something about JD made him pause. "She's sick," Ethan whispered, gripping his bag tightly. "And we don't have anywhere else to go." JD's jaw tightened. He was quiet for a moment, looking away as if lost in a memory. Then he stood up. "Let's start with getting you some food," he said. "Then we can talk about your mom." Ethan's heart pounded. He should walk away. He should. But instead he found himself nodding. JD turned toward the food tables, speaking quietly to a volunteer. A few moments later, the woman started filling a large paper bag with food. Ethan stared at it. More food than he had seen in weeks. JD returned and held out the bag. "Let's find somewhere quieter to talk." The ones where fate, or God, or whatever you believed in, sent help exactly when you needed it most. Or maybe he was about to make everything worse. Either way, as he followed JD toward a quieter bench, Ethan knew there was no going back now. Ethan's fingers curled tightly around the paper bag of food as he followed JD down the quieter side streets, away from the bustling rally. His mind raced. His mother had always warned him about strangers, especially ones who offered help too easily. But something about JD felt different. Maybe it was the way he didn't ask too many questions all at once. Maybe it was the way he'd spoken about his grandmother collecting bottles, like he actually understood what it felt like to struggle. Or maybe it was just the way JD's voice sounded. Steady, calm, like he wasn't just pretending to care. They stopped at a wooden bench in a small park just outside the plaza. Ethan hesitated before sitting, glancing toward the street as if expecting to see his mother appear out of nowhere, scolding him for talking to a stranger. Dee sat down beside him, resting his elbows on his knees. "You don't know who I am, do you?" he asked, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Ethan shook his head. "Good," JD said. "That makes this easier." Ethan furrowed his brow, not understanding. But JD didn't push it. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his expression turning serious. "How long have you and your mom been without a home?" Ethan swallowed hard. No one ever asked it that way. They usually danced around it with softer words, experiencing hardship, housing insecurity, just going through a rough patch. But JD didn't sugarcoat it. 3 months, Ethan admitted, staring at the ground. "Since she got too sick to work." He hesitated, then added, "She was a nurse, a really good one, but her hands, they shake now. She can't hold a needle steady, and she says nurses can't afford to make mistakes." JD nodded like this made perfect sense. "Medical bills?" "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "And no insurance after she lost her job. We stayed with some friends for a little while, but..." He trailed off. He didn't have to explain. JD already seemed to understand. "I do know," JD said softly, his gaze distant for a moment. "My mother and I moved around a lot when I was a kid. Stayed with friends sometimes. sometimes in places we shouldn't have been. People don't always realize how fast it can happen. Ethan's chest tightened. He had never met an adult who got it like this before. "The car's not so bad," he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "At least it's ours. As long as we move every few nights, the police don't bother us too much. And Mom says it's just temporary, until her disability application goes through." JD checked his watch. "I have about 20 minutes before I need to be back at the rally," he said. "Think your mom would be willing to talk to me?" Ethan stiffened. Warning bells rang in his head. This was exactly what his mom had told him to avoid. Adults who asked too many questions, who wanted to get involved. Adults who might call social services. JD must have read the panic in his face because he held up a hand. "I'm not going to call anyone. I won't do anything you don't want, but I know some people who can actually help, real help, not just a few meals or a warm blanket for one night." Ethan frowned. "Why?" The question burst out before he could stop it. "Why do you care?" JD exhaled slowly, looking at Ethan for a long moment before answering. "When I was about your age," he said quietly, "someone helped my family when we needed it. They didn't have to, probably had plenty of reasons not to. But they did it anyway." He leaned forward, meeting Ethan's eyes. "Sometimes help comes from places you don't expect. The trick is being brave enough to accept it." Ethan thought about his mother, curled up under blankets in their car, about how her hands shook so badly sometimes she couldn't even open a water bottle, about the coughing fits that left her gasping for breath, about the fear that sat heavy in his chest every morning when he checked to make sure she was still breathing. "She's parked behind the old Kmart," Ethan whispered finally. "The one that closed last year." He hesitated. "We have to be careful, though. The police check there sometimes." "I understand." JD stood, straightening his suit jacket. "Lead the way." Ethan clutched the bag of food tightly as they walked. His feet felt heavier with every step, doubt gnawing at his stomach. What if this was a mistake? What if he was making everything worse? But then he glanced at JD, the man who had stopped to help him pick up bottles, who hadn't looked at him with pity, who had spoken about his own past like it was something Ethan wasn't alone in. Maybe, just maybe, this was one of those moments his mother had always talked about, the ones where fate or God or whatever you believed in sent help exactly when you needed it most. And maybe this time, Ethan had to be brave enough to accept it. Ethan hesitated as they approached the old blue sedan parked in the far corner of the abandoned Kmart lot. Frost clung to the windows and the car looked smaller than usual, like it had shrunk under the weight of the past few months. His mother was still inside, wrapped in blankets, her face barely visible through the fogged-up glass. "Mom!" Ethan whispered, tapping gently on the window. There was a stir beneath the blankets, a slow movement as Rebecca Carter shifted and pushed herself upright. Her face appeared pale and tired, her eyes widening when she saw JD standing a few steps behind Ethan. Immediately she reached for the door handle and, despite the obvious pain in her stiff joints, managed to push it open. Her body positioned itself instinctively between Ethan and JD. "My son is just fine," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "We don't need anything, but I appreciate your concern." JD raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Mrs. Carter, I'm not here from social services, and I'm not a cop," he said gently. "I just want to talk, if you'll let me." Rebecca's eyes darted between JD and Ethan, her grip tightening on her son's shoulder. "How do you know my name?" JD nodded toward a prescription bottle resting in the car's cup holder. "I don't. I just guessed." His voice remained calm, steady. "But I'd like to know it for real if you're willing to tell me." Rebecca hesitated, her exhaustion evident. She looked at Ethan, who shifted from foot to foot, unsure of what to say. "It's okay, Mom," Ethan finally murmured. "He gave us food, real food, and he understands about not having a place to stay." Something flickered across Rebecca's face. Doubt, fear, hope. Slowly she exhaled. "Rebecca," she said finally, Rebecca Carter. JD nodded. I'm JD Vance. Your son found me. Or rather, ran into me. He was trying to get food for you. Rebecca's face crumpled for just a second before she caught herself, blinking back tears. Baby, she whispered, turning to Ethan. What did I tell you about? I know, Mom, Ethan interrupted, his voice trembling. Don't talk to strangers. Don't take food from people we don't know. Don't let anyone see where we sleep. I know. But I'm so tired of watching you be sick and hungry. His voice broke, and JD's different. Rebecca studied him for a long moment. Finally, she slumped back against the car seat. We don't need charity, she whispered, though her voice wavered. I'm a registered nurse. I just need time. If my disability application goes through, I can... It's not charity, JD cut in. It's community. He exhaled in relief. The diner, about 2 blocks from here, JD said. Warm, quiet, private booth in the back. No pressure, just conversation. Rebecca hesitated again, glancing down at herself, at the rumpled clothes, the unwashed hair. We can't, she murmured. Trust me. JD said with a small smile. Ruby's diner has seen worse. Something about the way he said it made Rebecca let out a soft, breathy laugh, something Ethan hadn't heard in months. But then her face crumpled again. I never wanted this for him, she whispered, gripping Ethan's hand. I had savings, insurance, everything they tell you to have. Then the symptoms started. The hospital bills, the specialists. I did everything right and still... Mom, Ethan whispered, wrapping his arms around her, it's not your fault. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. Then Rebecca straightened, wiping her face. Ruby's, she murmured as if testing the idea, then, more firmly, okay, but if this is some kind of trick... No tricks, JD promised, just breakfast. And some possibilities you might not have considered. He pulled out his phone. Let me make a quick call. There's someone I'd like you to meet. Rebecca tensed. Who? Her name is Carmen Rodriguez, JD explained. She works with a housing advocacy group, specializes in medical cases like yours. She knows more about disability claims, medical assistance, and long-term solutions than I do. Rebecca blinked. Medical assistance? JD nodded. Real help, not just a handout, but a way forward. As JD stepped aside to make his call, Ethan helped his mother out of the car. She leaned heavily on him, her joints stiff from the cold. I think he really wants to help, Mom, Ethan whispered. Rebecca pressed a kiss to the top of his head. When did you get so grown up? She murmured. Making decisions, taking care of your mama. I learned from the best. Together they watched JD speak into his phone, his free hand gesturing as he talked. Ethan didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in months he felt something unfamiliar, something he barely recognized anymore. Hope. 6 months had passed since that cold morning when Ethan met JD. Now, as he stacked cans at the Community Action Network's food distribution center, he couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. The boy who once searched through dumpsters for scraps was now helping others find their next meal. These go in the family boxes, Skye instructed, pointing at the large cans of soup. She had swapped her purple hair for bright green this month, but her warm smile remained the same. Extra protein for households with kids. Ethan nodded and carefully placed the cans in the correct bins. Every Wednesday after school, he volunteered here. A familiar voice cut through the hum of the center. Look who's here. Ethan turned to see JD Vance walking in, carrying a box of donations. He looked different in jeans and a t-shirt instead of his usual suit, but his kind eyes were the same. My weekly delivery, JD said, setting the box down. Though I hear you're giving me competition in the donation department. Ethan grinned. It was true. He had started a food drive at Roosevelt Middle School to collect supplies for the center. Mom's got her first shift at the clinic next week, Ethan said proudly. Just 4 hours, but still. That's incredible. JD smiled. The physical therapy must be helping. Ethan nodded. She's getting stronger, and the new medication is working better. He didn't add that they no longer had to choose between food and medicine, that part of their life felt like a distant memory now. Just then, Skye appeared, carrying a familiar food box. "Ethan, would you like to help deliver this?" she asked. "We've got a family moving into emergency housing today. Single mom, 2 kids. They could probably use a friendly face." Ethan took the box without hesitation. When the door opened, a young boy peered out, looking just as scared as Ethan had felt 6 months ago. "Hi," Ethan said softly, handing him the box. "I'm Ethan. Welcome home." Because sometimes a simple act of kindness could change everything. What about you? Have you ever helped someone in need? Or has someone helped you during a difficult time? Share your story in the comments below, and if this story touched your heart, give it a like. Because every small act of kindness can create a ripple effect that lasts a lifetime.